You've been eating rich and missing the genius of eating poor, meals born from empty pockets and pure creativity. Long before drive-thrus and delivery apps, these forgotten poor man meals kept families full when money was nowhere to be found. When money was tight, people made do with what they had. A pot of boiling water, a few potatoes, and maybe a pinch of salt. That was enough to create a meal. Potato and hot water soup was a common dish in working-class households, particularly during the Great Depression and wartime rationing. It was cheap, filling, and easy to make, which made it a staple when budgets were stretched thin. The concept wasn't new. Variations of potato-based soups had existed in Europe for centuries, especially among farmers who relied on their own crops. But in America, this stripped-down version became a survival meal, born out of necessity rather than tradition. Some families would stretch the flavor by adding onion skins, bay leaves, or even a splash of milk if they could spare it. Others thickened it with flour to make it more substantial. Nothing went to waste. Even potato peels, often discarded today, were sometimes tossed back into the pot for extra nutrients. The beauty of this dish was its affordability. Potatoes were cheap, available year-round, and could be stored for months. And while it may not have been a gourmet experience, it kept people warm and full. During the Great Depression, breakfast wasn't always bacon and eggs. Sometimes it was just a cup of weak coffee poured over stale bread. Depression-era coffee soup was a resourceful way to stretch both food and money, because when every penny counted, nothing was wasted. Coffee was cheap, especially if it was brewed weak and reused multiple times. Families would stretch a single pot for days, reheating it and adding water until it barely resembled coffee at all. When milk or cream was too expensive, this warm, slightly bitter broth was used to soften day-old bread or crackers, transforming them into an improvised meal. Some families added a sprinkle of sugar if they had it, while others used a dab of butter for extra richness. It was a survival meal, but it also carried cultural weight. French and Scandinavian immigrants had their own versions, sometimes called soupe au café or café soupe. What was once a traditional breakfast drink in Europe became a necessity in America when money ran out. The brilliance of this dish wasn't in its complexity, but in its ability to make something out of nothing. When flour was a luxury and wheat was scarce, people turned to what they had: cornmeal. That's how corn dodgers became a staple in struggling households across rural America. Corn had long been the backbone of Southern and frontier cooking, but during the Great Depression, it became even more essential. Cornmeal was cheap, widely available, and didn't require the refrigeration that more expensive ingredients did. Mixing it with water, salt, and sometimes a bit of fat or milk, families shaped the batter into small cakes and either fried them in a pan or baked them on a hot stone. The result? A crispy, golden bite of sustenance that could be eaten plain, dipped in water, or, on good days, smothered in gravy. The ingenuity behind corn dodgers lay in their versatility. They could replace bread, be carried on long journeys without spoiling, and even serve as a side dish to stretch a meager meal. Cowboys and pioneers ate them, and so did struggling families in the 1930s. For many, the taste of corn dodgers is a reminder of resilience, a symbol of making do when options were limited. A handful of cornmeal, a little heat, and a lot of determination were all it took. Lettuce past its prime wasn't something to throw away, it was something to transform. Wilted lettuce salad was a clever way to make the most of garden greens that had started to droop, and it turned an almost wasted ingredient into a dish with real flavor. This wasn't a crisp, refreshing salad, it was something entirely different. Instead of tossing out wilted lettuce, families salvaged it by dressing it up with a warm, tangy bacon grease dressing. The hot grease, often mixed with vinegar, sugar, and a pinch of salt, would slightly cook the lettuce, giving it a soft, savory bite. Sometimes onions or hard-boiled eggs were added if they were available. The practice of making wilted salads wasn't new. It had deep roots in Southern and Appalachian kitchens, where nothing went to waste. During tough times, people had to be resourceful, and using every bit of homegrown produce was essential. Lettuce might have been too delicate to last long without refrigeration, but with a little ingenuity, Even the droopiest leaves had a second life. Wilted lettuce salad was a reminder of the era's mindset. Waste nothing, use everything. It was about stretching ingredients, finding comfort in simplicity, and proving that even tired lettuce could still have its moment on the table. When meat was scarce and vegetables were running low, families turned to the most basic ingredients, flour and water. Boiled flour dumplings were a way to stretch a meal, creating something filling with almost nothing at all. The recipe was as simple as it gets: flour, a pinch of salt, and just enough water to form a dough. Sometimes, if an egg or a bit of lard was available, it was added for extra texture. The dough was then shaped into small lumps and dropped into boiling water or broth. In wealthier times, dumplings floated on top of a rich stew, soaking up the flavors of meat and vegetables. But during tough times, they were often served in plain water, with maybe a spoonful of bacon grease or a sprinkle of pepper for flavor. This wasn't just a Depression-era trick. Variations of flour dumplings had been feeding families for centuries. Immigrants from Eastern Europe, Germany, and the Appalachian region all had their own versions, adapting them to whatever ingredients were on hand. It wasn't a meal designed to impress, it was meant to fill stomachs. And for those who grew up eating them, boiled flour dumplings were proof that even in the hardest times, a little ingenuity could turn flour and water into something that felt like a meal. A hot meal didn't always mean something fresh from the stove. Sometimes it was as simple as a bowl, a handful of crackers, and some milk. Cracker and milk soup was one of the humblest dishes of the Depression era, basic, filling, and made with ingredients that lasted. Saltine crackers were cheap, widely available, and often handed out at relief centers. Families kept them on hand because they didn't spoil quickly, making them a reliable pantry staple. When bread was too expensive or hard to come by, crackers became the substitute. Some people crumbled them into a bowl and poured cold milk over them. Others warmed the milk first to make it feel more like a proper soup. If sugar was available, a sprinkle might be added for sweetness. If times were harder, water replaced the milk, turning it into an even more stripped-down version. This wasn't gourmet dining. It was about getting something in your stomach when options were limited. But for those who grew up eating it, cracker and milk soup was a reminder of the sacrifices families made, the resilience they showed, and the meals that carried them through. In the toughest of times, even something as simple as crackers and milk could feel like comfort. For families with little more than pantry staples, stretching a meal was an art form. Tomato gravy. Over rice was a perfect example of how a handful of cheap ingredients could be turned into something warm, filling, and, on the right day, even delicious. Rice was affordable, easy to store, and could be cooked in large batches, making it a go-to base for struggling households. The tomato gravy itself was a simple mix of canned or fresh tomatoes, flour for thickening, and a little fat, usually bacon grease or lard, to give it depth. Some versions were smooth, others chunky, depending on what was on hand. When money was especially tight, even just tomato juice and water could create a thinner, more soup-like version. This dish had roots in the South, where tomato gravy was often served over biscuits. But during the Depression, rice became a common substitute since it was cheaper and stretched further. Leftovers weren't wasted either. Extra gravy could be poured over cornbread or mixed into the next day's meal. It was proof that a little creativity could turn a sparse pantry into a meal that still felt like home. When every drop of food mattered, nothing went to waste, not even grease left in the pan. Bread and drippings was a meal that turned leftover fat into a spread, a sauce, or sometimes the entire dish itself. Drippings came from whatever meat a family could afford: bacon, sausage, or even a well-stretched roast. After cooking, the leftover grease was saved in a jar, waiting for its next use. It was brushed over stale bread, mixed with flour for gravy, or simply drizzled on top for a boost of flavor. When butter was too expensive, drippings were the next best thing. This wasn't just a Great Depression meal. It had been a staple in working-class kitchens for centuries, from European peasant dishes to Southern farmhouses. The idea was simple. Fat meant calories, and calories meant survival. In the toughest times, Bread dipped in warm drippings was the difference between going to bed full or hungry. Today it might seem like a forgotten relic of harder times, but for those who ate it, bread and drippings was proof that even the simplest meals could bring warmth and comfort. When apples were too expensive and food couldn't go to waste, people got creative. That's how green tomato pie found its way onto the dinner table, an unexpected dessert made from the last scraps of the garden. Unripe tomatoes, too tough and tart to eat raw, were sliced thin and cooked down with sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of vinegar to mimic the tang of apples. Once baked into a pie crust, the transformation was almost magical. The texture softened, the flavors melded, and if you didn't know better, you might not have realized you weren't eating apples at all. This dish had deep roots in frugality, especially in farming communities. When the first frost threatened to ruin unripened tomatoes, families picked them early rather than letting them go to waste. In an era where every ingredient mattered, throwing food away wasn't an option. For those who grew up on it, green tomato pie was more than just a dessert. It was a reminder of making the best of what you had. It was about ingenuity in the kitchen, where necessity was often the only option. Even in hard times, a little sugar and a lot of creativity could turn the unexpected into something sweet. People in hard times had a simple rule. If it had even a hint of usefulness left in it, you didn't throw it away. That's how something as unlikely as boiled corn cobs became the key ingredient in Corncob Jelly, a Depression-era creation that turned scraps into sweetness. After the kernels were stripped away for meals, the cobs weren't discarded. Instead, they were simmered in water until they released a light golden liquid. With a little sugar and pectin, that liquid thickened into a jelly that looked like honey and had a delicate, slightly corn-like sweetness. It was spread on biscuits, drizzled over pancakes, or simply spooned onto whatever bread was available. For farm families, corn was already a staple. Cornmeal, cornbread, and even corn dodgers were common. But corncob jelly was a stroke of ingenuity, proving that even the most overlooked part of a harvest could serve a purpose. It was especially popular in rural areas, where stretching resources was second nature. To some, corncob jelly is a relic of the past. To others, it's a reminder that making something from nothing wasn't just a skill, it was a necessity. It turned what should have been waste into something worth savoring, one jar at a time. When ovens weren't available, desserts had to be made another way. That's how settlers, sailors, and struggling families ended up steaming their sweets instead of baking them. Slump or Grunt was an old-fashioned dessert that took whatever fruit was on hand, fresh, dried, or even canned, and turned it into something warm and comforting without the need for an oven. This dish had deep roots in early American cooking, especially in New England, where wild berries were plentiful. The process was simple. Fruit was simmered with sugar in a pot, and instead of a crust, a soft dumpling-like dough was spooned on top. As it cooked, the dough steamed and puffed up, soaking in the juices. Some regions called it slump because the dough collapsed slightly as it settled. Others called it grunt because of the bubbling sound it made while cooking. The best part? It didn't require fancy ingredients. Flour, sugar, and whatever fruit was available, nothing went to waste. If berries were too expensive, apples, pears, or even rhubarb worked just as well. For those who grew up with it, slump or grunt wasn't just dessert. It was a reminder of how families made do with what they had, proving that even in hard times, a little sweetness could still be found. No one threw away stale bread when money was tight. It wasn't trash, it was the foundation of a dessert. Bread pudding with water sauce took something that would have been discarded and turned it into a warm, sweet dish that felt like a luxury, even when it wasn't. Bread pudding had been around for centuries, but during the Great Depression, it became a survival recipe. Stale bread was soaked in a simple mixture of milk, eggs, if available, sugar, and a pinch of cinnamon. Once baked, it transformed into a dense, custard-like dish. But the real ingenuity came with the sauce. Traditional bread pudding was often served with cream or butter-based sauces, but when those were too expensive, families made water sauce, a thin, sweet topping created with sugar, water, and a little flour to thicken it. Sometimes vanilla or nutmeg was added if they were lucky. It wasn't fancy, but it did the job. For struggling households, bread pudding with water sauce was proof that even the most basic ingredients could create something satisfying. It wasn't about excess or indulgence. It was about making the best of what was there and finding comfort in the simplest of things. When protein was hard to come by, people got creative with what they had. Peanut butter soup was a Depression-era meal that turned a pantry staple into a warm, filling dish that kept hunger at bay. Peanut butter was cheap, packed with protein, and didn't spoil easily, making it a lifesaver for struggling families. Instead of spreading it thin on bread, some turned it into soup. The method was simple. Peanut butter was mixed with water or milk and heated until it became a creamy, slightly nutty broth. Some added sugar for a sweeter version, while others used salt and onions to create something more savory. This dish wasn't just a product of tough times. Variations of peanut-based soups existed long before the Great Depression, especially in African and Asian cuisines. But in America, it became a way to stretch a single jar of peanut butter further than sandwiches ever could. It may not have been a culinary masterpiece, but peanut butter soup did what it needed to: provide warmth, nutrition, and just enough comfort to make a tough day a little easier. For those who ate it, the memory stuck. Not for its taste, but for what it represented, making do with whatever was on hand and turning the simplest ingredients into survival. When the Great Depression left families scrambling for affordable meals, one dish became a staple in relief kitchens and struggling households. Hoover Stew wasn't about fine dining. It was about making whatever was available stretch as far as possible. Named after President Herbert Hoover, who took much of the blame for the economic collapse, this dish was a mix of government-rationed ingredients and whatever scraps were on hand. The base was cheap: elbow macaroni boiled until soft, mixed with canned tomatoes, beans, and the occasional slice of hot dog. If a family was lucky, they might have added a few extra vegetables, but more often than not, this stew was about using what little they had. There was no set recipe. Some households made it thinner, stretching the broth to serve more people. Others loaded it up with starch to make it more filling. It was often served in soup kitchens, where large pots of it kept desperate families from going hungry. Hoover Stew was a reminder of tough times, of stretching every dollar, and of meals that weren't glamorous but got the job done. And in a strange way, it became proof that even in hardship, people found ways to make something out of nothing. There was a time when a sandwich didn't mean deli meats or fancy spreads. It meant whatever you had on hand, sometimes just 2 slices of bread and a few desperate ingredients. That's how onion and ketchup sandwiches became a meal. During the Great Depression, fresh vegetables were scarce, but onions were cheap and stored well. Ketchup, often considered a condiment today, was one of the few affordable ways to add a little flavor to otherwise bland meals. Put them together between slices of bread, and it became a poor man's sandwich: sweet, tangy, and just sharp enough to remind you it wasn't quite a meal, but it would do. There was ingenuity behind this simple combination. Ketchup, made mostly of tomatoes and vinegar, gave a touch of acidity and sweetness, while onions provided a crunch and some much-needed bite. For many, this wasn't just a makeshift meal, it was a way to stretch ingredients when grocery money had run dry. Some families added salt and pepper for extra taste, while others toasted the bread to make it feel more substantial. For those who ate them, onion and ketchup sandwiches were a symbol of making do, of finding a way to put something between 2 slices of bread when times were at their hardest. When sugar was too expensive and food had to stretch, people turned to what was available. Molasses milk was a simple but effective way to add some much-needed energy to the day. Molasses was a pantry staple in many homes, especially in the South, where sugarcane processing made it cheap and accessible. It lasted longer than sugar, had essential minerals like iron and calcium, and most importantly, it was affordable. Families would stir a spoonful into a glass of milk, creating a slightly sweet, slightly bitter drink that packed more nutrients than plain milk alone. Some even believed it had health benefits, making it an early version of a fortified drink. This wasn't just a product of the Depression. It had been around for generations. In farming communities, molasses was often used as a sweetener when refined sugar was too costly. Children drank it before heading to school, and laborers relied on it for an energy boost before a long day of work. For those who grew up with it, molasses milk was a taste of childhood, a reminder of tough but resourceful times. It wasn't fancy, but it was proof that sometimes all you needed was a little sweetness to get through the day. When party food had to be made on a tight budget, creativity took center stage. That's how Bologna Cake became a thing, an unusual but surprisingly resourceful dish that turned cheap lunch meat into something that at least looked impressive. Bologna had long been a staple of budget-conscious households. It was cheap, lasted longer than fresh meats, and could be eaten cold or fried. But when it came time for gatherings, families needed something that felt festive. That's where this layered creation came in. Slices of bologna were stacked like a cake, with a frosting of cream cheese or mayo spread between each layer. Some versions had mustard mixed in for extra bite. The final touch? A decorative piping of more cream cheese around the edges, sometimes with a sprinkle of paprika for color. As odd as it sounds today, this dish reflected a time when people made the most of what they had. In an era when processed meats were more affordable than fresh cuts, bologna found its way into countless meals. For some, bologna cake was a symbol of thrift and ingenuity. For others, it was simply a way to put something celebratory on the table when times were tough. Either way, it proved that with a little effort, even the humblest ingredients could be dressed up for an occasion. When grocery money ran low, dinner didn't always come from the store. It came from the backyard. Dandelion greens and bacon fat was a meal born out of necessity, turning what many saw as a useless weed into a life-saving dish. Dandelions had long been a part of foraged diets, especially in rural areas where wild greens were free and packed with nutrients. The leaves were slightly bitter, but that's where bacon fat came in. A spoonful of leftover grease, saved from a previous meal, was melted down and drizzled over the greens, softening their bite and adding much-needed richness. A splash of vinegar or a pinch of salt helped balance the flavors, making it a dish that felt more substantial than its ingredients suggested. Foraging wasn't just a survival skill, it was a tradition. Families who lived through hard times knew how to turn the land into a resource, finding food where others saw nothing. During the Great Depression and wartime rationing, this simple dish meant the difference between going hungry and getting by. Food waste wasn't an option when every scrap mattered. That's why even something as overlooked as potato peels had a purpose. Potato peels fried in fat took what most people would toss and turned it into a crispy, flavorful snack, or, on tougher days, a full meal. Potatoes were already a staple in struggling households. They were cheap, filling, and could last for months in storage. But the real ingenuity came in using the peels. Instead of discarding them, families saved the scraps and fried them in leftover bacon grease or lard until golden brown. A sprinkle of salt, if available, made them taste even better. Some even added vinegar for a tangy kick, mimicking the flavor of potato chips before they became a common snack. During the Great Depression and wartime rationing, people had to make do with every part of an ingredient. The peels contained nutrients that couldn't be wasted, and frying them in fat added the calories needed to get through the day. For those who grew up eating them, potato peels fried in fat was a lesson in resourcefulness. It proved that even the parts of food most would throw away could be turned into something warm, crispy, and, at least for a moment, satisfying. When a meal needed to be stretched, dumplings were a go-to solution. But when flour was scarce and meat was expensive, families had to get creative. That's how bologna and cornbread dumplings found their way to the dinner table, a dish that took two cheap ingredients and turned them into something hearty. Cornmeal was an affordable staple, especially in the South where cornbread was already a common dish. Instead of traditional dumplings made with flour, families mixed cornmeal with water or milk to form a dough. Chunks of bologna, one of the cheapest meats available, were folded in, adding a little protein and salty flavor. The dumplings were then dropped into boiling water or broth, cooking up into a soft, filling meal. This dish was pure ingenuity. Bologna was one of the most budget-friendly meats of the time, and cornbread was a familiar way to stretch a meal. Together, they created a dumpling that was easy to make, filling, and, at least in tough times, satisfying. Bologna and cornbread dumplings were about making something from nothing, using the simplest ingredients to create a meal that filled stomachs and carried families through the hardest days. When there was nothing left but the basics, survival meals had to be simple. Grits and water was about as bare bones as it got. No butter, no milk, just ground corn simmered in water until it thickened into something edible. Grits had long been a staple in the South, where corn was abundant and cheap. Normally, they were cooked with milk or broth for flavor, but when times were hard, even those additions were a luxury. Water had to do. A pinch of salt, if available, might cut the blandness. Some families thinned them out to make the pot last longer, while others let them cook down into a thicker porridge for a more filling meal. There was ingenuity behind this dish. Grits were not only affordable, but they expanded when cooked, making a little go a long way. Leftovers weren't wasted either. Cooled and hardened grits could be sliced and fried the next day, turning yesterday's meal into something with a bit of crunch. For many, grits and water was a meal born out of necessity, but it carried meaning beyond hunger. It was a reminder of resilience, of stretching every ingredient, of doing what had to be done. In a time when nothing went to waste, even fruit scraps had value. Apple peel jelly was a clever way to turn discarded peels into something sweet and spreadable, a luxury made from leftovers. Apples were a common ingredient in many homes, but when families peeled them for pies or canning, the scraps weren't tossed. Instead, the peels and cores were boiled down in water, drawing out their natural pectin and flavor. With a little sugar and sometimes a splash of lemon juice, the mixture was simmered until it thickened into a delicate amber-colored jelly. If sugar was scarce, a touch of honey or even molasses was used instead. The ingenuity behind this recipe wasn't just about stretching ingredients, it was about preserving every bit of food for future meals. During the Great Depression and wartime rationing, making something from nothing was a survival skill. Apple peel jelly was more than just a frugal recipe. It was a reminder of careful hands in the kitchen, of grandmothers who refused to let anything go to waste. It was proof that with a little effort, even the parts of food most would throw away could be transformed into something worth savoring. When a meal needed to be stretched as far as possible, soup was often the answer. Cabbage and dough soup was one of the simplest ways to turn a few humble ingredients into something warm, filling, and, on good days, almost satisfying. Cabbage was a Depression-era staple. It was cheap, hearty, and lasted longer than most vegetables. It didn't take much to turn it into soup, just water, salt, and maybe a bit of lard if it was available. But what made this dish unique was the dough. Instead of noodles or potatoes, families made quick, flour-based dumplings. A simple mix of flour and water, sometimes with a pinch of salt, was shaped into lumps and dropped into the boiling broth. The dough swelled as it cooked, making the pot seem fuller and the meal feel more substantial. Many immigrant families, particularly in Eastern Europe, had their own versions of this dish long before the Great Depression. But in America, it became a go-to meal when there was little else. For those who remember eating it, cabbage and dough soup was about getting through another day. It was a reminder that even when ingredients were scarce, a pot of boiling water and a little creativity could still feed a family. When fresh meat was a luxury and meals had to be made quickly, canned goods became a lifeline. Spam and noodles was one of those simple, no-frills meals that got the job done. Salty, filling, and just enough to keep hunger at bay. Spam had been around since the late 1930s, but it gained real traction during World War II when fresh meat was rationed. It was cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with enough fat and salt to last. For many families struggling to make ends meet, it became a reliable protein source. When paired with boiled noodles, usually whatever was on hand, from egg noodles to macaroni, it became a meal that could stretch for days. The preparation was as basic as it gets. The Spam was diced and fried in a pan until browned, then tossed with cooked noodles. If there was butter, that went in too. If not, a splash of whatever drippings were available did the trick. Some families got creative, adding canned peas or a sprinkle of black pepper for variety. Spam and noodles wasn't a gourmet dish. It was a reminder of resilience, of meals made from necessity, and of the days when a can of processed meat and a handful of pasta were enough to bring dinner to the table. When dessert was a luxury and the pantry was nearly bare, sometimes the simplest ingredients had to do. Sugar and butter sandwiches were a sweet, budget-friendly treat that turned basic kitchen staples into something that almost felt indulgent. Bread, butter, and sugar were common in most households, even in tough times. When cookies and cakes weren't an option, this sandwich became a quick way to satisfy a sweet tooth. A slice of bread, often homemade or slightly stale, was spread with butter, then sprinkled with sugar. Some preferred it with white sugar for a crisp texture, while others used brown sugar for a richer taste. In some households, the bread was toasted to add a bit of crunch. It wasn't just a Depression-era creation. Versions of this existed across different cultures. French families had pain beurre sucre, while in the South, some added cinnamon for extra flavor. The appeal was in its affordability. Butter added fat for energy, sugar provided a burst of sweetness, and bread made it feel like a real snack rather than just a handful of sugar straight from the jar. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives, and olives or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Cheese and potatoes are like a match made in heaven, and Grandma's cheesy, scalloped potatoes was straight out of any cheese lover's dream. So this casserole tastes even better than it looked, and let me tell you, it looked finger-licking delicious. The term scalloped comes from the French word escalope, which originally referred to thin slices of meat. However, in the case of scalloped potatoes, it refers to the thinly sliced potatoes used in the dish. Many grandmas used old-fashioned methods to make their cheesy scalloped potatoes, including hand-slicing the potatoes thinly, layering them with love, and cooking them slowly. Some even added secret ingredients they swear by, like a dash of nutmeg, a hint of garlic, or even a sprinkle of paprika for added flavor. The best part about this one was its crispy crust, and I'm sure you remember fighting all your siblings for the bigger chunk of it. This dish wasn't only tasty, but was also practical. It was a one-pot wonder, meaning it could be cooked and served in the same dish, making cleanup a breeze. I'm sure Grandma... While we're on the topic of bizarre, meaty meals, Hogs head cheese is another crazy one on the list. Now, don't let the name confuse you because the meal doesn't contain any cheese or in fact any dairy products at all. It is made with flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold, at room temperature, or in a sandwich. The parts of the head used do not commonly include the brain, eyes, or ears, but everything else? It's all in there somewhere. This unique meat jelly originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. Another great thing about this meal is its versatility. Got any spices lying around? Throw them in! A sad, lonely veggie waiting to be declared garbage? Throw it in too. It is the meal that will adapt to whatever you had in the house, not the other way around. It always manages to come out tasting like you put more effort into it than you did. Plus, let's be real. When you've got a pot of beans simmering away and some rice cooking on the side, it smells like home, which is what people at the time desperately needed to be reminded of. The beauty of bean and rice is that it is not just a survival meal, it is a comfort food packed with nutrition. While we're on the topic of rice, my personal favorite, rice pudding. A sweet reminder that nothing should go to waste, especially not leftover rice. In the era of the Great Depression, where every rice grain was counted, families found a way to turn yesterday's leftover dinner into today's sweet dessert. Rice pudding became the ultimate budget-friendly treat, transforming something simple into something comforting and sweet with just a little sugar, milk, and a dash of cinnamon if you were feeling particularly fancy. I know leftover rice seems kind of blah, but once it simmers into something that looks and smells like pudding, you'll forget what you were even talking about. Plus, it was an easy way to turn ingredients you had into something new, which saved you money and a trip to the store. It felt like a real treat even in lean times, and that's why it was so popular among families. A warm bowl of rice pudding could brighten up the end of any meal, turning frugality into a moment of indulgence. So even though it started as a way to cut food waste, it stayed a family favorite that warmed up even the coldest hearts in those freezing times. So you know how America and pulled pork go together like jam on toast, right? After all, it's something you can feed a whole crowd and have them feeling full and satisfied. It's a showstopper, but you can make a lot of easy things with it. Most dishes you can make and serve will have people asking you what your recipe is, but that's just how easy pulled pork is to work with. So when I say this next sentence, hear it with an open mind. How do you feel about cherry cola pulled pork? Yeah, slow-cooked, barbecue-y, savory pulled pork left to simmer in a pool of cherry cola, barbecue sauce, and other seasonings. The first time I heard of this dish, I struggled just to imagine all of those flavors in one bite. Like, barbecue sauce is a dip, pulled pork is a main dish, and cherry cola is a drink. You're used to having all that separately, right? Despite that, since it was all made from things that were so readily available in most homes, and since it was right up the alley of home chefs in their slow cooking era, it took off in a major way. Especially in the South, where everything involved in this dish is something people were already having on a daily basis. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil, a dash of salt, and you were good to go at basically no cost. Green bean casserole started out as a traditional Thanksgiving meal, but because of how much everyone loved it, it soon became a year-round delicacy. This one was also created as a creative way to market Campbell's cream of mushroom soup. When canned soups first hit the food aisle at grocery stores, many people were skeptical about them. Introducing new recipes was a way of encouraging people to add them to their daily meals, and Grandma really followed through with this one. The original recipe, known as the green bean bake, was developed by Dorcas Riley, a home economist at Campbell's. It combined green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and fried onions, and it was published in the company's recipe booklet. Our sweet old grandmas decided to make this one better by adding their own twists to the original recipe. Although traditionally rich and creamy, there were lighter versions of green bean casserole that used lower fat ingredients or alternative toppings to make it healthier. Perhaps it's time to give the good old goose a chance to shine again. Sheep's head stew. Now this is where things get a bit adventurous. This dish, once a staple in many cultures, involves cooking the entire head of a sheep, including the brain, eyes, and tongue. Yes, including. This one is a Scottish delicacy, also known as Pausouty, and was whipped up in Edinburgh, Scotland. Don't confuse it with the other Pausouty, which is a term for milk and meal boiled together. Dried peas and barley are other common ingredients used in this meaty dish. If we take a look at how Porcupine meatballs made their claim to fame, then the answer is pretty easy, my friend. You take canned food, a sauce that gets simplified for everyday use, and budget-friendly, high-quality meatballs, and you have an easy winner in the eyes of the people. This dish costs nothing to make and requires the simplest of things from you. It's probably all stuff you already have in your home, to be honest. How often do we really find ourselves without any onions or rice? The sauce might be a bit tricky if you're new to it, but any canned tomato sauce would work too. All in all, it's extremely beginner-friendly. It caught on because between the casseroles, the meatloafs, and the pot roasts, people needed something different, but similar enough that it could work for them on a daily basis. What they ended up finding was porcupine meatballs, among many things, but the recipe is largely forgotten nowadays. You just don't get to see it being made much in households, probably because the prices are much higher than they used to be, and because there's been a massive rise in takeout culture on top of it all. Its golden days in the 1950s and 1970s are ancient history now. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even Dandelion Salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Leftover turkey in the fridge? Consider it your lucky day, because that used to call for Grandma's legendary turkey noodle casserole. This casserole made mornings after Thanksgiving something to look forward to. This was the go-to recipe for using up leftover turkey and noodles after Thanksgiving or Christmas. All Grandma had to do was mix in the ingredients and add a topping made from breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even fried onions. Like most of the casseroles on this list, this was also a one-dish wonder and didn't require much labor. And you know Gram used to be tired from making us a grand feast the night before, so this was an easy way to serve something delicious on the dining table without putting in too much effort. This was a kid-friendly meal that appealed to even the pickiest eaters. What's not to love about a creamy sauce and some noodles all drenched in cheese? Now, this is one meaty dish. Well, it doesn't take rocket science to know why this one has vanished from our tables. I bet you're not up to the task of hunting a bear, are you? Elk roast was all the rage for Native American tribes. Elk is native to North America and parts of Asia, and people have relied on it as a food source for centuries. You know, back when cattle weren't common in the States. This roast was a favorite in regions where elk was abundant, and its sacred recipe was passed down from generation to generation. So, why was it such a hit back in the day? Well, apart from the tribe's sacred connections to the animal which made it a favorite, it was pretty easy to make too. It was often slow-cooked over hot coals. Think of it as modern-day barbecue, just without all the fancy grills and tools. Elk meat was replaced by more readily available options like beef and pork. It's a shame, really, because elk roast can be a delicious and healthy meal. Pickled beef tongue was a classic back in the day. Some love it. Moving on to something more concrete, Johnny cakes. They could be whatever your heart desired. A main dish, a side dish, something sweet or something salty. They were true soldiers during the tough times. These cornmeal-based pancakes were a lifesaver for families looking to stretch their budgets. With just a few basic ingredients, cornmeal, water, and maybe a dash of salt if you were feeling fancy, you could whip up a batch of Johnny cakes that kept everyone fed without having to pull a bank job. Bread was often too expensive or hard to come by. Johnny cakes were the affordable alternative that could be made from cornmeal, which was widely available and cheap. These little golden cakes were versatile too. You could eat them plain, or drizzled with syrup if you were lucky to have it lying around the house. Johnny cakes were filling and could hold their own as the main course or side dish. Some people might say that they were a bit bland, but what did you expect? A gourmet meal in those times? Johnny cakes were the epitome of resourcefulness. Just cornmeal and water mixed together and fried up on a hot griddle. Simple? Yes. But when you're trying to make every penny count, Johnny cakes got the job done and kept hunger away. Mock chicken legs, a true culinary illusion of the Great Depression. When actual chicken legs were too expensive to buy, people had to get creative, crafting drumsticks out of inexpensive cuts of meat like pork or veal and shaping them to look like the real thing. These so-called legs were then breaded, fried, or baked and served up with high hopes that no one would notice the difference. And honestly, in times as hard as those, nobody even cared which meat they were having, as long as it tasted good and filled you up. The beauty of mock chicken legs is that for a split second, you would forget that it wasn't an actual chicken leg on your plate, rather something that resembled one. It was a brilliant way for families to serve something that felt like a treat without the high cost. Plus, let's give a shout out to all those women who shaped that meat to look like a drumstick. That takes a certain level of dedication. It's a testament to how far people were willing to go to make ends meet while still putting something fun on the table. Mock chicken legs became household favorites, proving that with a little creativity in the kitchen, you could really stretch that budget. Pork cassoulet was what you went for as far as everyday meals go if you wanted to work some pork into the weekly diet. Pork cassoulet featured pork shoulders, or sausages in particular, and some of the typical ingredients you're used to seeing with savory dishes. Tomatoes, onions, garlic, all your usual suspects. Except this time it uses white beans like Great Northern beans. The reason you ended a crock pot, particularly for this, is that it is a stew, and the pork needs to be browned. Now you can include breadcrumbs for a crunch on top, but it kind of messes with the stew-centric vibe, so people used to leave them out. As far as the flavor goes, this is all savory, and it does not hide that fact from you at all. The slow cooking really lets everything combine into one massive profile that feels like it's made up of many different flavors, instead of a lot of tastes fighting for which one gets to stand out the most. When this was popular, pork was leagues more affordable than it is today, and the fact that you could either make this into a stew or a casserole meant that a lot of families found a lot of use for it. It fit the tastes of almost every prolific area in the country, like California, the Pacific, or the South, and it did great at keeping everyone full. Bean soup is different from the other soups on our list because, in contrast, bean soup was pretty simple to make. Dried red kidney beans in a thick soup made for a favorite of states like Idaho, where the dish originated from. You could find different ideas on the soup from house to house, as some had their vegetables as toppings and others had meats. Fred Dubois, who was Idaho's senator at one point, passed a bill that mandated the Senate restaurant to have bean soup on the menu every day. Definitely one way to start a movement if you ask us, but the trend definitely stuck around after it gained steam. It was an amazing way for low-income neighborhoods to eat healthy, but nowadays you would not find it in households as beans are not really the go-to item for soups. Love that. So squash might not be our top pick on a regular day, but Grandma's squash casserole was so irresistible that we found ourselves going back for seconds, or even thirds. This casserole was a staple in Southern cuisine and was Gram's favorite way of sneaking nutrients into our dinner. Squash is rich in vitamins A and C, potassium and fiber, making it a wholesome choice. Now, this dish was typically famous in the summer when squash was available in abundance, but you could freeze the veggie and enjoy it all year round too. Squash casserole was highly customizable, meaning Gram could tweak it by adding cooked bacon, sausage, or even fresh herbs. The secret ingredient that gave this bad boy its unique taste was a dash of hot sauce, so next time you attempt making this dish for a potluck, don't forget the key ingredient. Thank me later! Sheep's head stew was often enjoyed in rural areas where nothing went to waste. Skinning the head and preparing it for the stew is a time-consuming task, and it can get messier, but if you manage to pull this one off, it is definitely worth getting your hands dirtier than usual. Braised ox tail is proof that our ancestors really knew how to make the most of every part of an animal. An oxtail typically weighs around 8 pounds and is skinned and cut into shorter lengths for this Italian cuisine. This meat is slow-cooked in red wine and braised with vegetables such as carrots, tomatoes, and even lima beans. Oxtail is packed with collagen, so this dish was also used by many women of the Victorian era for younger-looking skin. Many women used to throw parties just to serve it. They took eat your skincare to a whole other level. While the word once meant only the tail of an ox, today it can also refer to the tails of other cattle. Today, this dish is a gourmet delicacy, but back in the day, it was every middle-class worker's dream. Love it or hate it. Staying on the theme of no waste or zero waste, whatever you prefer to call it, we've got ourselves split pea soup with ham. When money was tight and meat was a luxury, even the humble ham bone found new life as the star of this hearty dish. Toss it into a pot of split peas, and you've got yourself a soup that could feed the whole family for days. The magic of the soup wasn't in the peas, but in the leftover ham bone, which gave the soup that smoky, rich flavor you could ask for without actually needing any meat. That right there is kitchen creativity at its finest, bringing out every bit of goodness out of something that might have otherwise been thrown away. As the peas simmer and break down, the ham bone starts working its magic and releases all the flavors into the broth. If you were one of the lucky ones, you would catch a few small bits of meat still clinging to it. But never mind if you didn't, the bone still did its job. As far as everyday meals go, it gets pretty hard to outdo candied carrots if you're a middle-class home in the mid-1900s. As I'm sure many of you can relate to today as well, the little goblin in your brain that demands a sugar rush every other day for comfort is something humans throughout time have experienced. How did they get their fix? Well, you couldn't just get a caramel mocha frap from Starbucks like today, but you could take some carrots, boil them, and coat them in a glaze that was made from honey, maple syrup, brown sugar, and butter. Not really something that would suit the tastes of today, right? But don't knock it until you try it, because it actually did really well. Candied food was this entire niche genre of cooking back then that got popular. The whole glaze aspect was something people loved applying to every dish to see what sticks. These were a side dish that also worked for kids, so they got a lot of mileage out of family gatherings and dinner parties. But even besides that, it's still a great way to work some carrots into your diet. As far as the taste goes, they definitely hit home. It feels like any other treat you'd be eating, though when we think of candy today, we might be more used to hard and mushy textures like in hard licorice or sour candies. This was tender though, and it would melt in your mouth. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. The French also made a significant contribution to delicious casseroles with the easy shepherd's pie. It was a meaty casserole traditionally made with lamb meat. Shepherd's pie has its roots in British cuisine. The name shepherd's pie specifically refers to the use of lamb, while cottage pie is used when beef is the main ingredient. This one was an easy one to make as it didn't require hours of preparation. The dish became popular in the UK during the 19th century, particularly after the introduction of potatoes in the late 18th century. This one was used for meal prep, as it was great for making ahead and freezing. It was known as hachis parmentier in French cuisine, but different countries came up with their own version of the shepherd's pie. In Australia and New Zealand, it's often called cottage pie, and in some places the dish includes sweet potatoes or other unique toppings. It's not a part of our dinner tables anymore, and I don't know about you, but a lot of people want to keep it this way. Can you imagine Thanksgiving without your grandma's famous turkey roast? Well, back in the day, roast goose was the traditional holiday dish. It was cooked using dry heat with hot air enveloping it evenly on all sides. Now, this is a dish I can get behind. Juicy, crispy skin, tender meat, and a flavorful stuffing. What's not to love? This dish was normally served with plum sauce to augment its flavor. It was particularly popular in England, where it was often served with applesauce and bread sauce instead. In Guangdong and Hong Kong, roast goose was a variety of siu mei, or roasted meat dishes, within Cantonese cuisine. It was made by roasting geese with seasoning, often in a charcoal furnace at high temperatures. This dinner isn't common anymore, but with a little effort, you can still find fresh goose and recreate this classic dish at home. Vegetable pot pie was proof that you didn't need meat to make a satisfying meal. When times were tough and the meat was either too pricey or just plain unavailable, families turned to the next best thing: vegetables. Awful alternative for all of us who hate veggies, but you had to do what you had to do just to get by. The humble pot pie, traditionally packed with chicken or beef, took a vegetable-only turn during the Great Depression. It consisted of hearty vegetables like potatoes, carrots, peas, and some onions. Vegetable pot pie was a filling, flavorful dish that still gave you that comforting feeling of a homemade meal. And nobody here can even imagine what that must have felt like. When all you ate were just scraps of whatever you could find, getting a vegetable pot pie must have felt like getting a roasted steak. Plus, it was a great way to use up whatever was in the garden or on sale at the market. No meat? No problem. Those veggies could stand their ground. Cooking a vegetable pot pie wasn't only about stretching the budget, it was also about creativity. You could throw in whatever comes to mind and call it dinner. If you, by some miraculous chance, got any canned tuna, that would go in there also. And let's be honest, upon cracking open that golden crust, it didn't matter what lay inside. It only mattered that you had food on the table. Beans and rice, a dynamic duo that has been filling up bellies for generations. In lean times, this combination was a nutritional powerhouse with protein, carbs, and plenty of flavor, all without costing much. When money was tight, beans and rice were the way to go. They were cheap, filling, and could stretch to feed a whole family with just a few basic ingredients. If we take a small intermission from the dessert side of things and step on over to some hearty, comforting, and homely soups, we'll find a golden recipe lost among the cookbooks of the 20th century that don't get to see the light of day anymore. Pea and Ham Soup got its name because of how affordable it was. This is probably the cheapest thing on the list to make. Actually, it literally costs just a few cents. All you needed was ham and peas. You'd simmer them in the crock pot with diced ham and some vegetables like potatoes and celery, then slow cook it until the soup got thickened. You'd get this incredibly creamy, lovely soup that was just perfect for winter nights or after a long, exhausting weekend. Maybe you want to ease up on your stomach and eat something healthy for a change, but you still want some familiar flavors to keep you company. A soup like this would be right up your alley. It costs nothing, feels better than most things, and you can make it any time. You could probably even take a nap and wake up to the scent of the soup slowly cooking, becoming the final product. Also, boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. While the southern states were enjoying Tex-Mex cuisine, the northern states were all about Italian flavors, and baked ziti was a staple on the dinner table. Now, even with its Italian roots, you wouldn't typically find this one in Italy. This casserole was created by grandmas who were Italian immigrants to the States and adapted traditional pasta dishes to suit the ingredients available in their new country. Baked ziti was pretty much the long-lost cousin of lasagna, with the classic version including ziti pasta, marinara sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella cheese. The ziti pasta used in the dish was tubular and smooth, which makes it ideal for holding onto the sauce and cheese. This one was a hit at Sunday dinners and had everyone coming back for seconds. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe and let us know if you ever came across any of these meals.